Peace, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of a video we're doing talking about my book, Fostering False Identity. I'm going to let everyone come in for a few minutes. First of all, though, hope everyone, not that we celebrate Thanksgiving because of what we know it represents, but those of you who had family time, hopefully you all are doing well. Hopefully your families are doing well, and hopefully everyone has been safe during this time. Y'all, I am dealing with a cold that I caught from my son, so I'm gonna be drinking some tea like I usually do, but my voice might sound a little hoarse. Just know I'm dealing with a little illness right now, but everything's good. So let me just share this live, and we will get started very soon because this is probably my favorite topic that I spoke about in my book. It was one that was the funnest chapter to write for me. It was one that was kind of more like a healing energy for me, or a healing power for me to understand that our identities are empowerment for us. And if we can understand that being African, there's a strategic reason to understand that we are African. There's a strategic reason to understand who we are inside of this world. There's a cultural reason, there's political reasons. And people who try to go back and forth on this whole, we don't need to represent ourselves as being African. We can be something separate from that based on our American experience. A lot of us are kidding ourselves, unfortunately, and we're underestimating the power that comes from self-identifying with who you really are. So that's what we're going to discuss today. Like I said, let me just share this video with a few platforms while we get started. But everyone in the chat, if you let me know how you're doing, if you hear me okay, and we will get started in just a moment. Okay, just sharing this to social media, and we'll get started. So, as some of you know by now, Fostering False Identity is a book that I wrote earlier this year, and it's really based on the foster care system. And being about the foster care system, a lot of people would think that there's not an identity component to it, a cultural identity component, or a component that relies on you identifying yourself as being white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, anything. But that's a major deception. And that's one of the propaganda that gets taught to us through the system, that we do not need to identify ourselves as anything when it comes to children, raising children, and ensuring that children are having a good upbringing. One thing that we're constantly taught is that it just matters that there's a loving home. The cultural foundation is secondary to having a loving home. Now, obviously, we know that having a loving home for a child is very important, but we also can't underestimate the power that comes into play whenever that child is surrounded by who they are, whenever they're giving a perspective about their history, whenever they're spoken to about their past in their present. And that's something that they try to tell us doesn't matter, because in America, the agenda is to whitewash us, to make us all think that we are all a part of this system, even when we're not. And it's a very sick thing that happens. If you think about what happened during the transatlantic slave trade, the most horrible thing was trying to strip a people of their identity and make them think that they had a stake inside of the plantation system, despite the fact that the plantation system was literally founded on their demise. But this is a part of the African experience that we have to explore. So I'm going to start this video with a few questions for, if the audience chimes in, that's great. If not, just think about them and let it settle in. I'm making this video in light of the fact that I understand there's a lot of debate about things like the ADOS movement, the American Descendants of Slave movement. There's a lot of debate about the foundational Black American movement, this idea that we have to identify as something separate than what our African brothers and sisters are. I'm making this video in light of that, understanding that a lot of us might not feel African. When you say you're African, some of us might not feel it inside. So let's just ask some questions to pose, what does it mean as far as identity to you? Ask yourself, who are you? Who are you really? Like, Are you just your name, or are you something bigger? Are you a lineage? Are you a history? Are you are you your bloodline? Who are you? Where do you come from? What does that do for you in the present? How does that affect your current reality? What's in your DNA? What's in your bloodline? Like I said, these are things that we should think about when we're identifying who we are. Most importantly, if you are someone who identify yourself as being African American, do you identify your history as beginning in slavery, or did your history begin in freedom? This is something that might be important if you're trying to have a perspective on what fighting for freedom looks like. Because if you began your history in slavery, you want to have the same understanding of what freedom is as someone who started their freedom, there's history in freedom. And we have evidence of this. If you look at the differences as far as how our people responded to being enslaved, people who were once free had a different response. People who were once free had a different fight. So that tells you again why there is an intentional effort to get people to unsubscribe themselves to a particular identity. You can also ask, are you an acronym? Is that enough to identify you? Are you a color? You know, some people feel sufficient saying I'm Black. What does that mean? What does that do for you? Just identifying as a color. I think Black means the abundance of color, whereas white is the absence of color. Is being a color sufficient for you as far as identifying who you are and where you're going? If you just identify as being Black, is that more revolutionary than other types of titles that we have used? I think Black, we've taken the term and empowered it because we know that there's this stigma that Black means evil. But are we giving ourselves any more perspective than we had whenever we called ourselves colored, or whenever they called us Negro? I mean, Negro, I believe, is the offshoot of Negra, which means Black. Are we really doing something separate and revolutionary from that? These are questions that I think are really powerful whenever you're trying to understand what your identity is. So if you are someone who called yourself foundational Black American or American descendants of slaves, my question to you is, what does that tell you about who you are? Are you only identifying with the institution of slavery versus the institution of terrorism? And I'm asking these things not in an antagonistic way. I've had obviously back and forth with the ADOS crowd, and I'm no longer interested in those. I know a lot of people still willingly go back and forth on this. I don't, because I think that at the end of the day, you're going to believe what you do want to believe, but you should ask yourself these vital questions. What are you getting from your belief? So obviously, this is the African Esquire TV channel. Anyone who watches this channel, and this is also We Charge Colonialism, anyone who watches this channel knows by now that my identity is African. Now, I'll say that there's two different ways to look at that identity. There's the cultural identity, and then there's the political identity. So the cultural identity is understanding, like I said, my people did not begin inside of enslavement, and my people brought their culture with them whenever they were taken from the African continent. Now, some people argue, and we're going to debunk a lot of these notions, I think, whenever we get into the meat and juice of this conversation. Some people have argued things like, whenever people were enslaved, their culture was wiped from them. You know, they don't have any reference to Africa. Africa is something that's far far away from our present. I'm going to go through some proof that that's actually not true, but let's just say hypothetically that the white man was successful in wiping away our cultural connection to Africa, that he was actually successful in making us devoid of our African culture. Let's assume that for argument's sake. As Kwame Ture said, if you take an African lion and bring him to America, does that make him now an American lion? No, it doesn't. You know, he comes from Africa. That's who he is. If you take him and you, generations later, you keep breeding African lions, do they become American lions over time? No, they're not less of an African lion because they're in the Americas, despite the fact that they might have no reference as to what Africa looks like. So that whole idea, we have to challenge it because, first of all, it doesn't make logical sense. If you're identifying your ethnicity means your ethnic background, who you are, like I started these questions off. you're identifying what your ethnicity is. You can't have this idea that it change. So how can it be wiped away? The test of time will make you less of your ethnicity. That's not logical sense. And I would say that's a lot of the cultural component. Now, the question might be for someone, well, what if I'm half and half? What if I'm, mixed, biracial, and I have different cultures that I adhere to? And I personally don't feel offended when people who have mixed ancestry that they actually know of, that they came into, not that they went out of their way to try to identify with European culture that they weren't even exposed to, or went out of their way to expose themselves to some culture that has nothing to do with, how they wrote. And not saying that that's, necessarily bad, but if you're doing so motivated out of like self-hatred, trying to distance yourself from being African, which some people do, then obviously that's questionable. But there are some people who were raised with other cultures other than being African. Some people came up with different European cultures, different indigenous cultures. But can those people still identify as being African? I would say yes, but you understand that this is not just a cultural identity. Obviously, you have multiple cultures and ethnicities working at the same time with you. This becomes a political identity, because if that same person goes into any part of the world, more likely than not, if you have any substantial amount of African ancestry, while they might not be able to trace or tell what exactly you are, they might not be able to tell if you're European or Hispanic or Asian or Native American. They might not be able to tell that. 9 times out of 10, if you have any substantive amount of African ancestry, they're going to be able to tell you're Black. It's funny. There's some people, we call them racially ambiguous. That means that we know that you came from something that is mixed with Black, but we can't exactly put our finger on it. So this is a reality that a lot of our people deal with, is that they say, well, I'm Black and white, and I can identify with both. I would say, is that smart? If you're biracial and everywhere you go, you're living the life of an African person. Is it smart to identify yourself as being neutral when there's no neutrality in this world? Is it intelligent? Is it empowering? And is it empowering us understanding that many times the European cultures who you might be mixed with ethnically, those same cultures have oppressed your African side. So I would say, for those people, I don't try to push anyone's, you have to identify as this, especially if you feel torn between two worlds. But politically speaking, you probably live the life of an African person. And I've seen Paula Patton, the actress, said something about this recently, that she was taught essentially you're going to live the life of a Black woman. We've seen repeatedly people of mixed ancestry, people who are biracial, being targeted by the police. And those people are not targeted because of the things that they, the ethnic makeup that is not easily identifiable. The easily identifiable one, 9 times out of 10, is your African ancestry. So if you're going to be targeted based on your African ancestry, you're going to be living the life of an African person. You're going to be living the life of a second-class person, whether it's in America or abroad. Why would you organize as if you are neutral? Why would you organize as if you have no stake in the fight? You have a stake in the fight. It's with the African liberation struggle. So that's where it becomes a political identity. And by the way, these are my takes. This is not something I read about. This is just from my observation and from myself, how I have learned to deal with the different issues of identity. I understand myself culturally an African. That's the vast majority of my DNA. That's the DNA that was robbed and stolen from me, but it's still what's in me. But I also identify myself as African from the continent, inside of a perspective and a political perspective. A political perspective, understanding that without a universal African freedom struggle, that Africans everywhere are still going to be oppressed. So with that being said, let's get into this chapter. And I think what I'm hoping to hopefully get you to consider, regardless of where you fall on this identity issues, I want you to consider, first of all, how does the issue of identity affect children? How does it become weaponized against children? And you might not think that it does become weaponized against children, but let me tell you, the slave masters who oppressed you and your ancestors identified a way to weaponize identity against children. And we're thinking about child welfare. How does the idea that you're not going to intentionally push a child to identify themselves with their ethnicity, how does that work in the hands of the white man? Particularly when you go back to the previous chapters of my book. And by the way, I'm supposed to post it inside of the chat. I almost forgot. Again, this is chapter 4 of Fostering False Identity that we're basing this on. If you go back to the previous chapters that I spoke about last week I did chapter 2 and chapter 3. And those 2 chapters go specifically into how the child welfare system really began as a assimilation campaign to basically get children who were of different ethnicities, whether they were European ethnicities that were not Anglo-Saxon, or whether they were Native American ethnicities. The idea was we're going to get these children to come into whiteness. So it does become weaponized, regardless of if you feel like it or not. So let's go and identify how this affects children and how we should be trying to protect our children, because I think that's ultimately all of our major goals. So I will check the chat real quick, see if there's any comments or any questions. I see Gregory Jones identifies as African in America, and I do too, with the K. We understand the K as an act of rebellion, as a political act of rebellion, and it's a cultural act of rebellion because inside of African languages, there's no C, there's Ks. We have, let's see, if you start, yes, absolutely. John Henry Clark, he said, if you start your history with slavery, everything since then becomes like progress. And that's something I think you have to think about if you identify yourself as slavery. The question becomes, if you're only identifying yourself as slavery, how are you going to politically organize to have a destiny in a world outside of slavery? That's a real question I think that a lot of people have to ask. And I think we're going to get started with that. All right, so traditional African families. So let's go back to the continent of Africa, pre-colonialism, pre-enslavement. What was our African family structures like? This is a summation. Even in my book, it's a summation. I encourage you all, there are many books that I cite that give a breadth of information to these issues of culture. And even more so, there are books that I don't cite that you can find about the African family experience. These are just the ones that I have tried to draw out to help us to see the importance of the family structure. So if we go back to Africa pre-colonial times, there were different types of societies. You had some societies that were stateless and decentralized. They were pastoralists or hunters. You had some that were kingdoms. And that were basically the tribes that made up the kingdoms that were run by chiefs. That was the composition of the different societies. And then you had some that were powerful empires. So there wasn't just one African society prior to infiltration of Europeans. And that's important to understand, that despite all of these different setups, all of them were familial driven. In all of them, the family had a pivotal role. And to this day, if you think about what we need inside of our communities, it's for the families to once again have a pivotal role inside of our discourse. Now, it's important to understand when you're talking about the African family, it's not what you consider the European family structure. In the European family structure, the role is that the nuclear family comes first. So you have mom, dad, daughter, son. Maybe grandma can come in every once in a while, but that's the family that we're going to focus in. That's the family that receives the priority. And really, that's not something that is who we are ethnically. Ethnically, who we are goes beyond a nuclear family. Who we are is solidarity that goes to extended family. And in Africa, it would be based on blood ties more often than not. But still, these were people outside of just your kids, your mom and your dad. It was a community. And the community could be seen as a family just as much as the wife and the husband. You could have a cousin, an uncle, and they all have equal regard as being part of the family. Now you think about how this contrasts to European society. It's not anything of what we're used to seeing. Now, it's important to also understand how the role that the individual played inside of the family. because in this world of Africa prior to colonialism, the individual inside of the community was inseparable, and the community for the individual was inseparable. It was the community first. I am my community. My community is me. Very different from what we see today, and we'll talk a little bit about how this differs from European culture that many of us have subscribed to because we've been taught this is the only way to live, essentially. This is important to understand extended families. They often live together and they support one another by providing each other with basic needs. So you think about how the conditions in the environment in Africa might necessitate organizing together for food and clothing and shelter. These are the things that benefited people who were communal minded. And you think about how not being communal minded could affect you. You're an individual living on your own. You could be subject to harsh weather conditions. You could be subject to drought. You can be subject to wild animals. There's different things that individuals can not deal with the same that communities can deal with. So we see the power. I hope all of us see the power in communalism. Why that was what made sense, but also why that was in the DNA of Africa, because one, there was a shared unity, but two, also it just made sense politically, or not politically, but it made sense as far as survival. Now, when we say communal, what are we saying? Inside of African societies, land could not be bought or sold by individuals. It was held in common. And this is very different than what we see all over the world today. But this concept really comes from Africa, this idea that we share the lands. You can have someone come onto the land and occupy the lands, but we are still, the community still owns the lands. So if that person who occupies the land decides that they want to not treat the land right, they want to do things that are destructive to the land, well, we allowed you to have this land. We allowed you to occupy this land, but we can take it away from you and we can give it back to the community. This is something that comes out of African society. I'm going to read a quote from Julius Nyerere about the traditional African family. He said, "The traditional African family lived according to the basic principles of Ujamaa. They lived together, they worked together, because that was how they understood life and how they reinforced each other against difficulties they had to contend with. The uncertainties of weather and sickness, the depredations of wild animals, and sometimes human enemies, and the cycle of life and death. The family members thought of themselves as one, and all their language and behavior emphasized unity. The basic goods of life were our food, our land, and our cattle." Now let's compare this to European individualism. And we should know in European society, individualism is like gold. They're like the individual above everyone. Be individual minded. Battle of the fittest. I for me, and me and my family. That's what I hear a lot of our people say. Oh, I just gotta care for me and my family before I care about what's going on in the community. You're parroting your European individualism. Now, in European families, the nuclear family is essentially the family. Extended family members are, even like if you look at the differences, there are polls that were taken as far as Africans in America, or so-called African Americans, versus our interaction with our extended family, our cousins, our aunts, versus European interaction. And I found that by far we interact with our extended family a lot more. This is because in their culture, that has evolved into what it is today, the nuclear family is central. This is also, you find these sentiment being pushed inside of philosophy. Obviously, we also see it propagated in media. The Cynic philosophers of ancient Greece, they called for a total abandonment of community in place of self-fulfillment. Aristotle theorized that the ideal society was one in which individuals sought out the good life, obtaining personal happiness. Now, the extended family, again, that didn't come into the picture for European societies because at this point, given the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, they found it more easier to work towards an individual's interest and not towards a community's interest. But it must be understood as only motivated by selfishness. It's not motivated by abundance. It's motivated by scarcity. And if you're acting like you're under scarcity, you're not necessarily going to do what's best, whether for yourself or for your people, because scarcity will incite into someone barbaric attributes. And I would say individualism has become just that. Now, one more thing I want to emphasize about the African family when it comes to the communal lifestyle. The extended family basically took on the children's role, the role of caring for the children, the same that you had the mom and dad. And that's very important to understand, particularly when we go back to the child welfare system, that inside of the extended family, it wasn't, oh, this is Tyranny's child and this is just your responsibility, so take care of your child. The extended family, that was their child. You're bringing a child into the community. That child is going to be a part of the identity of all of us. We're going to take that on. We're going to raise that child together, and that child is going to be an extension of us. This, again, is something that comes out of Africa. So if you think about how it contrasts to how we are told to interact, we're told to interact as far as like, don't touch my child, don't discipline my child, I'll take care of my child myself. Now, if you're a people who's living under white supremacy, and we're going to end out the video with this, but if you're a people who's living under white supremacy, just think for yourself, taking on this mentality that my child is only my responsibility. How does that help you whenever you're constantly under threat of domination, you're constantly under threat of violence, you're constantly under threat of multiple things? How does that affect you? And that's something I want everyone to think as we go throughout this chapter. Now, let's talk about this. Actually, let's take a break and see if there's any questions. Let's see. Okay, GOJ says, I identify as Black American, ADOS or FBA. I use them interchangeably. Let's see. And I'll come back to that. I'm actually going to scroll up some. If you start your history as an African, slavery still exists. Well, what we're saying when we're saying this is that if you understand, the American economy was built to be a plantation economy. It was never built for free Africans. So when we're saying that we identify as something as a form of liberation, how do we reference our beginning in slavery? Now, I'm not trying to push anything on anyone because that's just not my interest right now. But I can tell you, for me, identifying with Africa, that was a free civilization that has a history that spans thousands of years, identifying with that has given me a perspective on what liberation feels like. I don't feel liberation in America because America was never for liberation of anyone. America was for genocide of the Native American. It was for the enslavement of the African, and to this day, they continue that legacy. So I would just be curious, for someone who identifies with the system of enslavement being their beginning, how does liberation come into the picture? How does it become imagined? How does it become obtainable? It's kind of like, the quote said earlier from Dr. John Henrik Clarke, everything is progress when you begin from slavery. But when you begin from freedom, this America that we deal with, if I'm dealing with freedom, being autonomous people, having control over my resources, control over the lands, having plenty, if I'm dealing with that as my beginning versus enslavement, then enslavement, anything today, what we're dealing with today is progress. Today, what we're dealing with today, despite the fact that it's morphed into a current system of social control, it's still progress. These are things that we should ask, I think, whenever we're dealing with what we want to identify as politically and culturally. Okay, we have a question. It says, do you think that when white supremacy, let me pull it up on the screen so y'all can read it. Do you think that when the white supremacy knew that did they know what they were doing when they were constantly destroying our communities in the past to discourage us community? Absolutely, and we're going to talk about that momentarily because we're going to talk about the goal of destroying the cultural link to Africa. That was actually intentional. We should understand it didn't happen like, hey, we're in America now, we're enslaved, so let's just forget everything that we've built, everything that we were. No, this was an intentional campaign, similar to, as I said, if you go back to chapter 2 and chapter 3, there were similar campaigns to erase ethnic identities done to other Europeans who were not Anglo-Saxon, and also done to Native American persons. So there's precedent for this. And if you remember back to what they were saying, their whole goal of erasing culture was because they saw that culture was a threat to their dominance. To them, we're not going to be able to occupy these people. We're not going to be able to turn them into slaves and handcuff them. We're not going to be able to do these things if we're not able to erase the idea that they can live on their own, that they can live separate from a white existence, that they can live separate from the American experience. This was all intentional. I think it's very important. Now, I don't see any other questions. And as I said in the previous video, y'all, if you want to put a question mark, I can know if there's a question. Oh wait, I think I see one. Okay, why can't we identify as Africans, and the Black folks who want to stay in America can be like colonies? Let me read that again, make sure I have it right. Why can't we identify as Africans, and the Black folks who want to stay in America can be like colonies? I don't know if I quite understand the question. You can tell me if I'm wrong in my understanding, but I think you're saying like people who want to stay in America, you can stay in America while identifying as African. If that's what you're not, that's not what you're saying, you can correct the question. But in my opinion, I don't have a problem with people identifying as African who want to stay in America. If anyone knows my position though is that America, if this is the state that's going to continue to exist, I don't see it ever morphing into a society that's fully accepting of us as a people. But again, if you want to have that identity and staying in America, I have no problem with it. I just think that we have to be very strategic, because identifying as African but living inside of a white part of town might not be the best, political move. Identifying as African and being the only Black family in the state, that might not be, able to get the benefits. A lot of people want to move down south. A lot of people want to go in high concentrations where Africans are. These are all things that I think should be analyzed and thought out thoroughly. But I also understand that we've seen repeatedly there are many Black states that have majority Black populations, or majority Black cities rather, or Black areas. And what we see inside of these instances is that political power doesn't necessarily come from having yourself well represented as far as your ethnicity. So I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind whenever we're talking about trying to stay in America, if that's your choice. All right, so I think we're good with questions. Wait, what's the success rate of the system whitewashing African Americans? I would say it's hard to analyze, obviously, because there's no statistics that I can cite that say how many people have been whitewashed. But I think that the thing that's going to separate Africans in America from Africans throughout the diaspora is just how effective this misidentification campaign was. Because if you know about the enslavement systems in other parts of the world, not that any of them were better, not that any of them were more humane necessarily, but they didn't put an emphasis on you cannot be your culture. They did not put an emphasis on erasing their African cultures. That was something that was intentionally done in America, and it was done to create kind of this perfect slave. Whether or not the Willie Lynch letter was real, we can identify many of the same things. This idea that you perfect, someone who's servile, someone that's going to take authority from someone else. These are things that were well thought out as far as how we're going to indoctrinate these people to do what we want them to do and not see themselves as having their own autonomy. So, all right, everyone, we're going to talk about Africans in American slavery. It's important to understand our beginnings inside of this system. So we should understand that Africans in America, our life inside of slavery, it's always been one of surveillance. It's always been one of exploitation. And the American chattel slavery system is one that intentionally tried to find a better way to control these Africans. And everything that you see inside of this system is going to replicate over time. It's going to come back. Whenever we do the later chapters, we're going to talk about how the African community after slavery was really deteriorated, but the systems of social control always come back. So you should look at the system of slavery, chattel slavery, as kind of like the first big social control institution in America. You can look at it even as the first child welfare social control, because obviously children were slaves just like adults were slaves. I would say that, as I said again, American slavery, that it was very intentional on wiping away the African culture. And to me, that was one of the most destructive things that you could do to a people. And I think that if you don't understand the attachment to culture that indigenous people have, go to places with indigenous populations. It doesn't even necessarily have to be Africa. It could be go to a place in Asia, go to a place in Latin America where you have the indigenous cultures. Those cultures are central to those people. And when you take those cultures away from a people, it can be a way to really cripple a people, cripple their self-conscious, cripple their ability to think for themselves. And I think that it has that effect on us today. Now, we're going to talk about the destruction of family structures inside of America. So obviously, whenever you're inside of slavery, your autonomy is ripped from you. You don't get to pick who you want to marry, and the slave master just goes along with it. A lot of times they did try to, formulate their own marriages. We all know about, obviously, jumping the broom, but these marriages were not recognized by the racist system in America. Since they were not recognized, it was very easy to be bought and sold away from your spouse. Same thing with children. Over a third, this is something I didn't know before writing this book. Over a third of enslaved children were raised in homes where one or both of their parents were absent. Think about that. That's crazy. Like, you're literally being raised in a home and you're taken away from your parents. Over a third. So you have this aspect of tearing away families. You have the state not recognizing African families. You also have the rape of African women. Very significant event. Don't let this huge event, this huge part of our history, don't forget about it, because one, obviously the woman had to deal with trauma. Trauma can last for generations and generations. Whenever you're being raped and brutalized, it's probably one of the worst ways to oppress a person. It's one of the worst ways to terrorize a person. So the women are dealing with trauma. The men are being emasculated because men who are the protectors of the community are watching their own wives being raped by this white man and this white man could be someone who is basically weak, like someone you could easily take out, but because of the guns, because of the system, you can't do anything about it. That does something to the man. So there's trauma to the woman, trauma to the man. Obviously, if you're impregnated by the master's child, regardless of if you're married or not. But let's imagine being married and you have a husband and you're having to raise your enemy's child and your husband, is there for it all. These are very traumatic events inside of our history. And I hope we don't skate over the effect that rape has had on the African community. I think it's probably one of the worst aspects of the enslavement system. So you have all these things happening at once. And in this whole system, we're deprived of our autonomy. You as a parent, you can't decide what's going to happen with your child. You can't decide where they're going to go. You can't decide what they're going to eat. You can't even decide, let's say you have to work out in the fields for 12 hours. You don't know who's watching your child. But that's where communalism kind of came in, because a lot of times, though those people did not have their children, the elders would come in and take the children and help raise them. Now I'm going to read from a quote real quick. I don't have who this quote is from. I believe it's John Henrik Clarke, and I will double check just to make sure. It says, in the United States, in the fight to destroy every element of culture of the slaves, the system was cruel. Yes, this is John Henrik Clarke. He said, no other system did so much to demean the personality of the slave, to deny his personality, or to ruthlessly sell family members away from each other. The American slave system operated like the American brokerage system. If a person bought 20 slaves at the beginning of the week and fought himself short of cash at the end of the week, he might, if the price was right, sell 10. These men might be resold within a few days. The family, the most meaningful entity in African life, was systematically and deliberately destroyed. And I hope we can allow that to resonate. Our families were systematically and deliberately destroyed by this system. There's nothing redeemable about any slave system. There's nothing redeemable about what was done to our families. We should do everything that we can to erase our interactions with the European slave system. And if you are someone who decides, whatever, I'm still identifying not as African, I'm identifying as a descendant of slavery, that's your business. I'm not here to press anything on anyone. But I hope, as a part of your agenda items, you specifically separate from any of the evils that have been taught to you, whether it's inferiority, hatred of Africa, hatred of your African heritage and lineage, or if it is the idea that you have conflicts with within your family that were not naturally of us. If you have hatred towards your man or your woman, if you have disgust with your children, take time to undo what has been done to us. That's what I think is very essential that we do. All right, so I'm going to go to the comments and just see what's going on. If we have any questions, again, please put a question mark if there's questions. Let's see. Okay, why do you think a geographical, I think this is the question, why do you think a geographical or subcontinental application of such as the term African is more valid than any other title? What makes the term African more valid to our heritage and history? So the title African to me becomes empowerment. Number one, you have to also link this to what was done during colonialism. During colonialism, the continent of Africa, and also slavery, but the continent of Africa was recognized as being one. And so it was systematically undone to basically ensure the conquering of all the people. Something I think people don't quite understand is that whenever they were colonizing Africa and whatever they were going in and taking territory, they intentionally would draw borders that literally like went right through nations. So they were dividing nations. They were lumping people in together who were not normally lumped in together. And they were doing so to create a new identity into them. The idea to them was that if we can do these things to strip these people of their ability to organize on their own, then they'll be for the taking of us. So if you understand how also all these European powers came together to undo Africa, literally, we know at the Berlin Conference, all of these powers, Germany, Portugal, England or UK, I don't know if I think they were just England back then. Who else at the Berlin Conference? I believe Russia was there. Like all of these countries were sitting at a table, all of these European countries. And that's the other thing we should ask the question of, despite the fact that they were different countries, different languages, they all seen themselves as having one interest. They were all European. So these same powers came together and decided that, hey, we're going to go into this marked territory and we're going to overrun it unlike any place we've ever done before. That necessitates us understanding that our African culture, our African heritage bonds us together unlike any other distinguishing characteristic that you can think of. It's also important to understand the same thing happened with this transatlantic slave trade. Again, it wasn't just Portugal, wasn't just the US. Literally, all these people come together and they say, okay, we're going to take this area, you take this area, don't interfere with us here, we'll trade slaves with you here. These were systems undertaken by Europe in order to conquer this continent. So when you understand that aspect, the political aspect, that they sought out this continent as being a separate place that's going to be for the taking. There's also the cultural aspect, obviously. Many Africans throughout the continent, and I understand that in today's time, obviously the African continent has changed in composition a lot. You have, for example, in North Africa, people who are not ethnically African, but overwhelmingly in places where you find people who are of the African ancestry, our cultures are similar in the very basic tenets of African life. Family is being central, family being extended, life being communal. The people, the treatment of the people, major things and aspects of our cultures are aligned inside of a singular fashion. And I think that there is a cultural bond. It's funny if you ever meet talk to continental Africans and see like how do they relate their culture to other places in Africa. Even in fact, like I've talked to continental Africans about how they see places where the culture was not stripped from them, but like Jamaica or Haiti, like they're like, oh, this feels like Africa. There's a cultural unity inside of the continent of Africa that also bonds us together. So I think there are multiple tiers. I'm sure there are many other people who have different perspectives on why we identify as African, but I think there is a singular identity with basic tenets, and also there's a political identification that we were a marked people by the European conglomerate that said, okay, this particular area of the world with the most riches, the most landmass, all of these things, this place is the place that we're going to put our eyes on. Looking for questions. Let's see. What are the major issues preventing the unity of ADOS and Pan-Africanism? Um, so one thing I've identified is that a lot of people who identify as ADOS and FBA don't necessarily subscribe to everything that the architects of those identity movements subscribe to. And that's important to emphasize. I do think that you should take time to study what was the rationale to Yvette Cornell and Antonio Moore to create a separate identification, since they were the ones who started it off. I think it's important to also see the follow-up comments that have come out of these people, out of their thinking about why these identifications are necessary. And think long term, I think, whenever you hear them. I think a lot of times what you hear coming out are ideas. Sorry, told y'all I have a cold, so bear with me. A lot of the things that you hear coming out from these figures are things that are antagonistic to the African experience, and particularly antagonistic to Pan-Africanism. We should understand Pan-Africanism is not this idea that we all necessarily just go back to Africa and just, try to blend in and, live our happy existence. Pan-Africanism isn't this idea that Africans come to our rescue, and these are not Pan-Africanism. The basic idea of Pan-Africanism is, if you go to America, you look at African people, we're in our worst condition. Go to Haiti, we're in the worst condition. Go to Haiti, African people in the worst condition. Go to Europe, African people, worst condition. When I mean worst condition, worst treatment, worst discrimination, worst isolation, economic isolation, being placed inside of ghettos. All of these things, these systems are built up. These are all intentional. If you see that these things are intentional in every single place in the world, I dare any of you to find a place in the world where Africans are not dealing with these issues. If this is a common theme everywhere where we go, we have to understand this is not a domestic problem. This is an international problem. This is a global phenomenon. The racism that happened when Ahmaud Arbery was gunned down by the police, that is not something that's just within the borders of the United States. White supremacy is a global phenomenon. The structure of white supremacy is a global phenomenon. Regardless of where you go in the world, they have ways and systems to ensure that they have the upper hand, and these systems work together. I think that's what we have to understand. They make you think that it's just the American Supreme Court that's, the one that's over America. No, all of these institutions, from the United Nations to Organization of American States to all of these institutions, the WTO, they work collaboratively towards the same end. The same end is global domination of European society. That's what their goal is. So when we understand this, the intelligent analysis says that we can't fight these things apart. We can't fight, this white supremacist system on our own. We fight it in different spheres. Maybe you're in America, you're organizing in America, and maybe you're in Africa, you're organizing in Africa. Maybe you're in the Caribbean, you're organizing in the Caribbean. And we link our struggles together, understanding that a global front against this structure is powerful, as opposed to a divided and separate fight. That's literally all it is. Now, there are different analysis of Pan-Africanism. For example, me, I'm not just Pan-Africanist, I'm also a socialist. Scientific socialism, I adhere to Nkrumahism. These are different philosophies that you might adopt as a Pan-Africanist. Some people are like, I'm okay with capitalism, if it's measured or something like that, as long as it's not as crazy as it is inside of certain places. There's different ideologies that come into play. But ultimately, the central agreement is that we are fighting a global phenomenon, and any attempts to keep us separate are working against us. And if you don't agree with me that the idea that we can fight separately works against us, don't take my word for it. Look at the United States government. Look at their response every single time that we have united with forces outside of the United States. Look to the response whenever you had Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, that's the prototype. Because if you think about it, what he was saying, he was not saying, overturn the government in the United States. He was not saying, he was literally saying like, let's go to Africa and start something by ourselves. This should be seen as completely non-antagonistic to the systems of the United States. Why is it that this man telling Africans to build for themselves for the purpose of going to leaving America? Why was that antagonistic to America? Why was the identification with Africa antagonistic? Why was the UNIA newspapers banned in the African continent? Why was it when W.E.B. Du Bois and William H. Patterson, when they were going to charge genocide to the United Nations, why was that a threat? That they were uniting and going to the international courts. Why was Malcolm X in Africa? Why was he surveilled heavily by the CIA every single time this African man was going from Egypt to Ghana to going around the African continent? Why were they focusing in on this man who was meeting in Africa? Why? These are a few examples. There are many examples. Historically, if you look at the documents, the covert operations, this has always been a threat to them, and they do everything that they can to thwart any efforts to connect the struggles globally. I'll use one more example: Maurice Bishop. Maurice Bishop, if you think about him, he was a leader in Grenada, a small island, should have been no threat to the United States. But his stance of going and connecting to the Pan-Africanist struggle, that was a threat to where they would assassinate this man on this small island, especially because he was showing the contradictions of capitalism by having a country that was technically poor, but the people were doing better than the Africans in the United States. So don't believe me, believe the history, study the history, analyze the history, think intelligently. If these people are your enemies, why are your enemies so threatened whenever there's a movement to internationalize the struggle? That's the question I think we should be asking. Let's see. Why are we using this term identifying as? Wouldn't that mean anyone can simply choose their identity? Well, I use identifying as because that's literally what people are doing, regardless of if we use that term or not. Let me be clear. I believe that you are African. Culturally, absolutely. But I do think that people politically are not African. I think people mentally are not African. I think people mentally have adopted what they wanted us to be. They wanted us to be a Negro. They wanted us to be a nigger. They wanted us to be someone with an absence of conscience. And so I do think that, and when I say culturally, I mean ethnically too. Obviously, we're African. When I say identifying as, there's a political issue here. People have subscribed to this idea that I can be I can attach myself to my oppressor, and that I can be devoid of my Africanness. This is something that is real. And if you want to see that there are people who do not have an identity crisis, some people will fight you over this empire, despite all the crimes that have been done against your people there. So that's why I use the term identifying as, because I do think it's a political identity. Obviously, we know many times inside of our history, people who were ethnically, culturally African fought ferociously against us as a people whenever we try to identify politically with Africa. So I say identify as, but I understand your point. Ultimately, if you are of African ancestry, like I said, you're African, whether you accept it or not. But I understand politically people adopt different classifications of themselves. All right, I'm going to do one more, then I'm going to go back to the conversation. Okay, so we said, recently I was in Freetown, Sierra Leone. I didn't notice too much African pride. Europeans, Chinese, etc. Dominated industry. How will going back help us having more buying power? Well, I didn't say buying power. To be clear, I think that when we're talking about repatriation, that our focus should be on land and sovereignty. So understanding that if you, and anyone, wherever you're fighting, if you stay in America, talk about land and sovereignty. Don't talk about just integrating into the system. You don't want, why would you trust the system to do right by you? You should be fighting for the ability to self-govern. To me, that's more realistic in Africa because it's our historical, that's a place where historically Africans were sovereign. And on paper, we're supposed to be sovereign. But like I said, it's not necessarily a do all be all, because as I've said many times on this channel, people who go back to Africa and just basically take their American mindsets and try to oppress and be like the white men in America, those people I think are unhelpful to the African struggle. Things like, we have to start all the industries and all these things. Are these industries going to mimic capitalism? Because if they're mimicking capitalism, that's not changing or reversing our circumstances in Africa. That's repeating capitalism. So we have to become uncomfortable with white supremacy inside of Blackface. I think that's a central, important aspect to us understanding that we have to find ways to have a true identity of our issues being the European civilization being embedded inside of the cultural mindset instead of Africa. And I think when we have that mindset, we'll be able to fight ferociously for our autonomy and for our sovereignty. Okay, so I am going to move on. And because I do want to get through this, and as I told y'all, I'm not feeling too well today, so I think it's important to finish. Now, I want to talk about what happened as far as the transatlantic slave trade. So let's just talk concretely. When I say Africans were taken from the continent, they estimate 9.6 to 10.8 million Africans. We did Walter Rodney's reading recently, and he said, you really can't measure how many Africans were taken from Africa because the records were not reliable. But this is, them trying to keep track of how many Africans were taken. Probably way more. We'll never know, unfortunately. Where did the Africans come from? I think it's important to say where they came from. Obviously, Africa is a big continent, so let's be very specific. They came from seven main regions of the African continent. Senegambia, that's from the Senegal River to Casamance, Sierra Leone, which that territory was from Casamance to Assini, which is modern day Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast that encompasses modern day Ghana, the Bight of Benin, which stretches from Volta to the Benin River. You have, which is today Togo, Benin, and southwestern Nigeria. Also, we have southeastern Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, West Central Africa, which is now this Democratic Republic of the Congo, Angola, and we have Mozambique and Madagascar, which are today modern day Mozambique, Tanzania, and the island of Madagascar. That gives you a visual of where our ancestors were taken. There are countries more aligned or more targeted by the transatlantic slave trade. Now, with that, let's understand. These people brought their culture to America. I hope we can agree with that basic tenet. You did not get captured by white people and say, oh, I forget who I am. No, these people brought their culture. They brought their linguistic culture. They brought their cuisine. They brought their music. They brought their religion. They brought all of these things to America. And so that's very important to understand because the oppressor recognized that. And here we go with the intentional effort to get us to separate from that. So I want us to talk about, I think, 3 dangers that we risk whenever we decide that we do not identify as African. Now, one is that we assume that when us identifying as African works for our own good, but it really does help our oppressor win. And I want to tell you why. We should understand that the white slave master had a clear agenda. You have all these Africans. By the way, when they first came, they didn't speak the same language. So, different people speaking different languages. A lot of them were not from the same tribes. He sees all these Africans. He sees all these people who have their culture, who adhere to their culture. And they said, we have to do what we can to disassociate these people from that culture in Africa. This was intentional. So because of that, you are not allowed to practice your culture in America. You're not allowed to speak your language. Okay, you are not allowed to worship your gods. You are not allowed to dress, your traditional dress. Everything was controlled, tightly controlled by the slave master. And this is, again, unlike other expressions of slavery other types of slavery that we've seen throughout the transatlantic experience. And the goal was they had to turn these people who were once free. They knew what it was to be free into lifelong slaves. That's a very hard transition. Think about it. If you were once free, not even what we experience here in America, because I think we all know, hopefully we know that this experience that we're having in America, it's not one of freedom. These people who were free, they were sovereign. They knew how to control, they controlled their own government affairs. They were in control of their lands, in control of, what was going to happen as far as their community. They had a say. They had, they were represented by their cultures, by their societies. These same people had to become slaves for the rest of their lives after tasting freedom. That's very difficult to do. And that's why they made it their business to ensure that they made sure we weren't able to identify as African. That's why they called us Negro. That's why they called us nigger. That's why they called us different things, to make us feel like that's who we are. And unfortunately, as I said, I think many people unfortunately have embodied these pseudo identities instead of embodying that, no, we're an African people from the African continent. Now, the other thing, obviously, you don't want, if you don't have an understanding of being African, then you don't have a reference point as far as, this slave master not telling me what to do. And if you've only seen someone tell you what to do, tell you where to eat, tell you when to sleep, tell you where to live, if that's your only reference point, again, it's just difficult to get people who were once free to go into that system. Now, that's the one issue, but I think we also have to understand the danger of not honoring our ancestors who were victimized by slavery. And this is going to be contrary, I think, to a lot of people's narratives. Some people say, identifying as American descendants of slave or foundational Black Americans, that these identities kind of, they uphold our ancestors. It's the opposite. I think we should understand that. What you understand when you look back and read through history, particularly history of the Africans who came to America, the first generation Africans, we should understand they were incredibly attached to their home. They were attached to their people. And you hear about these sad stories of people who, and their goal was getting back to Africa. That was their goal. Their goal was once again going home, once again being with their people, once again having the land that they were born from and that their ancestors were born from. That was what they thought about. That's what they dreamed about. Even being passed on generations to their children who might not even, their children who didn't even get to see Africa. They were told about this place where, you were honored and your elders were honored. They were told about this place where we were free. They were told about this place, and they kept these stories alive. That's, I think, something that's not often known. They kept these stories alive for their children, and their children had a reference of, this is what was stolen from us, and this system that we're in is not what was created for us. This is something that was created for them. So they understood this, and because our ancestors understood their culture, and they loved their home, and they fought many times to get back home. But also, there's a lot of examples of enslaved Africans who were able to get back home. Not a lot, but there are some examples who were able to get back home. That's something that we should honor, that these people were not disengaged from who they were. But because they understood that this was being this agenda was intentional, they also found hidden ways to express their culture. And this is something a lot of people don't recognize. You're finding ways to express who they were that were not going to upset the master. That was a way of resistance. And obviously there are other ways that they resisted. Some of them ran away from the plantations. Some of them killed the masters. Some of them, fought back. Other people practiced their culture despite the fact they were told not to. And I think that's important to understand. So I'm going to give you some examples of ways that Africans have practiced their culture while they were being enslaved. You have language, family, religion, oral traditions, folklore, music. Now, this sounds abstract. Let's go through some specifics, real specifics. I'm going to tell you some words that actually come just right from Africa. And we say these things today, not knowing that all these words actually are African words. Words like bogus, bug. So you hear someone say that's bogus. That comes from Africa. You call a bug. I call a bug. Call an insect a bug. Call someone phony. Yam. We have yam, the sweet potato. Tote, gumbo, jamboree, jazz, funky. These are just some words that have African roots. They found hidden ways to keep their language alive. Our cuisine, deep frying our gumbos, deep frying our foods. These are African ways of cooking. Our music, sea chanties, yodeling, the use of falsetto, that was heavily influenced by African tradition. When you go into churches, or other religious places. You might see call and response. People have linked that to Africa, that did not come out of slavery, that came out of Africa. And then obviously growing certain crops that the white man was not accustomed to growing, things like rice and sweet potatoes. These are things that they were able to do because of their African lineage. Very important to this conversation about child welfare, they brought their understanding of extended family. We call this kinship family ties: respect for elders, reciprocity, selflessness, willingness to assume responsibility for relatives outside of your immediate family. These are things that they brought with us. And this brings me to the last point I'm going to make on what the dangers are of disassociating from our culture. The third danger is survival. I believe very truly that if Africans who were enslaved did not bring back particularly their survival methods, specifically with the extended family, many of them would not have survived slavery. What I mean by that is they understood that there was power in doing this together, power in leaning on each other, power in helping each other. And particularly whenever slavery ended, you have basically these white slave masters, like, you either going to stay on this plantation and keep working or go out there. People who did leave the plantation relied on those communities, those extended family ties that they built, these principles of communalism, living, trans-residentialism, having multiple people living with you. These are things that saved many people. Had they tried to go out into the world as an individualist, they would have perished, because that was not the conditions that the environment warranted. And these are kinship family ties are something that's very precious to the African experience, because it allows us to lean on others mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, lean on other people whenever we are without our basic necessities. These things are very critical. And I want to just emphasize this again, because just going back to the child welfare system, if you think about people living together all at the same time, this is a means of survival for us. Inside of the white courts, they will try to use this as a way to say, oh, this is neglect. Why aren't you taking care of your child? Why aren't you individual? They want us to be individuals. They don't want us to be a community. Why aren't you individual taking the responsibility of your child? Why do you have this stranger? I actually remember one time when I was in court, and this caseworker, this is like, many of you know the story. When I first, got in the child welfare system, I would say I was a part of the system. Then I woke up to what the system was, and I turned the other way. This is when I was woke to the system, when this came out in court. A caseworker went and said, well, we feel like we should remove this child because there's people always in and out of the family home, different people. This is who we are. We don't have just our nuclear family. We have people who are extended family, and they don't have to be related by blood. This is, again, a survival tactic. And this is I will argue at the end of this video that this is the danger that we risk, because this survival tactic, if we do not continue it, particularly us in the United States and also us everywhere, because we're all under siege. But those of us who are in white supremacist dominated economies and societies, if we do not learn to revert back to these kinship formations where we could survive with each other instead of surviving by ourselves, we will suffer and continue to suffer. And we've already suffered a lot. So with that, I'm going to go back to see if there's any questions. All right, so I see the European practices clanism. What unified the European? We see consistently the European has been unified by shared individualistic interests. That's what I would say. Even though they think, again, individually, they recognize that, hey, you over there, we have the same interest in maintaining our power. So let's come together as one. This is another question. It says, FBA and ADOS have little or no respect for elders. How does this impact positive futures? And in respect for there is a change, I think, coming, or not coming, that's been in play, where things like respect for elders that were indigenous to us are being lost, because, again, we're subscribing ourselves to this idea that we that this nuclear family is our power, and that our extended families are not our power. It's a deception. We have to call this a deception. This system's very smart. They know how to keep us conquered. And again, next week, whenever I do the next chapter, you're going to really see that these things work deliberately whenever the system comes in and throws in their drugs, throws in their mass incarceration. These are ways to keep us very controlled. See another question, I think. Let me see. Um, is there any proof besides? Oh, this is a debate. Sorry. Um, looking for any other questions by anyone else. I don't see any. Okay, here's the last one I'll take. So it says, can we identify the origin of the term African? I've seen many debates on this. I've heard convincing arguments from different folks. And some people say that the term African came from Africanist, but I do believe this is a myth. And there's a brother who did a really good breakdown of this, and you can do background research on what he pulled up. I will find it and I will post that inside that link to his video inside of the comment section. Okay, so I'm going to bring this back. We're going to talk about the Black system for child welfare. So we talked about the kinship family networks, right? Extended families. How does this work? How does this work in a modern sense? How does this work whenever you're dealing with police surveillance? How does this work when you're dealing with the economy? If in case y'all didn't see, this economy is going down really quickly. You see inflation rising. A lot of people are unemployed, whether from COVID or whatever. A lot of people are unemployed. How does this work for survival inside of a place where when white people are doing bad, we know that the Black community is always going to be doing worse because the whites actually control the system. We are surviving the system. Now, extended families have been known to help with things like unstable employment. You have marital instability. A lot of us need our elders to come and help us figure out our problems. Instability in housing. I'm sure many of you have seen this. You'll see people like 3 families living inside of a small apartment. These are things that come into play whenever you need family to step in. Now, it's important to link the deterioration of kinship family ties to our inability to protect ourselves, because whenever you look historically, the more African kinship networks were underutilized by our people, the more vulnerable African families became. And it's important to understand this because in a modern sense, you don't see the same reliance on extended family. I think that the system has done a very good job on indoctrinating us into thinking that we have to live as individuals, that we don't live as a community. And it has only been to our demise. Dorothy Roberts, she's a very very acclaimed professor who writes on child welfare. She wrote, social networks and resources have dissipated, and social isolation is a more likely reason for finding child neglect. This is how it links directly to child neglect. If I can't take care of feeding my child, I'm living on my own. I'm a single mother. I can't take care of my child. I can't keep this house going. I can't keep paying rent. I'm trying to do this on my own. How do you survive this system? A lot of people, when you listen to why they're in child welfare system, you think about, if Africans were still operating under extended family systems, these problems that you're dealing with would not be happening. And I think that's an important emphasis. I'm going to emphasize this later in a later video, that we had a system of child welfare. Our system of child welfare was us taking care of our own. That's literally what we did. We took care of our own, meaning our communities. It was not unordinary to have people in your community sharing responsibilities as far as taking care of your children. But the farther we've gotten away from that, the farther that we've left this communalist way of operating, the more and more deep we've become to where we're dependent on the state to do what we do best ourselves. This is a theme of this book. The state cannot take care of us like we can take care of ourselves. And they try to make us think that we can't take care of ourselves. That's the really perverse thing about white supremacy. They make you feel, whenever you say we need to do for ourselves, they make you feel bad about it. No, this is historic. Like, you have to have a way for African people to make these decisions, to provide the necessities on our own. The state is ill-equipped to handle our problems. Now, I'm going to end this video with a very sad story, and I'm using this because it's an example of why I think that we should understand the risks that the system has put us in. I'm trying to share my screen. Actually, I'm going to share this specifically. Okay. So I'm sure you all see this. I'm going to tell you about this young woman. Some of you might know the story, but I'm sure many don't. So I'm going to go through this. So this is a woman. Her name was Tabitha Walrond. This was August of 1997. She was a 19-year-old African mother from the Bronx. And again, I'm saying African, African American, some might say, a mother from the Bronx. Her name was, again, Tabitha Walrond. She had a 2-month-old baby. His name was Tyler. Tyler died from starvation. She had been exclusively breastfeeding her son, but she had an operation where she had a breast reduction operation. And because of this, her breasts were not supplying sufficient milk for the child. Now, she was advised by her own mother. This is her nuclear family. Her mother told her that basically, it's fine, just keep feeding him exclusively. She sought assistance from social services, from the healthcare system. She was turned away because she did not have a Medicaid card. So she sought assistance for her child. They turned her away. She was convicted of criminally negligent homicide because her son died. He was not getting enough food, exclusively breastfeeding. And she was sentenced to 5 years probation instead of a 6-month prison term that was sought by the prosecution. The judge said this whenever she was sentencing the mother, basically saying, I understand this was a hard decision for you, but she said, the mother is the bottom line, meaning, this was your responsibility. You were supposed to take care of your child. You're the bottom line. Now, why is this significant? A few reasons. One, you see that for Miss Tabitha, that she was ill-advised by her mother. And this is where having extended family helps also, because it's not just one person's advice. It's not just, I'm going to trust this one person. You have other elders in your community who chime in, other people who will tell you, your child is not getting enough milk. You cannot be exclusively breastfeeding. So that's one place where the Kinship family network could have been really essential to saving this 2-month-old baby. Then here again, you have social services. She could not access social services because she did not have her Medicaid card. The state failed her too. And because of this child died. Now, it's also, and obviously she had a Medicaid card, a doctor probably would have told her, hey, you need to stop exclusively breastfeeding. Your child's not getting enough food. The judge, though, says that the mother's the bottom line. That's not our culture. The mother is not the bottom line. The community is the bottom line. The African community, the extended family network, that is the bottom line. So I hope that you kind of see that these are the things that we leave ourselves exposed to whenever we are individual minded and whenever we're not communal minded. More specifically, whenever our organizational structures of kinship, of communal living, whenever we allow these things to be destroyed, we've been left vulnerable as a people, and we're still fighting a very vicious enemy throughout history. Obviously, slavery did not end, and then we were all accepted into, America and able to live, peaceful lives. Right after slavery was Jim Crow, or right after it was the Black Codes, Jim Crow, the prison industrial complex, the crack epidemic, all of these things government instituted. All these things affecting us to this day, redlining, all of these things affecting us to this day. I hope we understand that if we're trying to do this as individuals, trying to raise children, that we have a significant risk that we will fall prey to the system or be unable to care for our children and unable to know what's best for them. And then they step in and tell us that we're bad parents and that they're going to make those decisions for us. So that's what I have. I'm going to go back and see if we have any questions. Let's see. Why do we even need ethnocentric identities? Why not just be humans and socialists? I don't agree with that at all. I'll tell you why. You found power in your ethnocentric identity, I believe. You find perspective, you find connection to the people who came before you. You find practices that empower you. Again, I said this earlier, anytime whenever you come to a people who are indigenous and in tune with their indigenous cultures, those people are very, very prideful and cherishing of their culture because they find empowerment from it. So it's not just empowerment as far as not just knowing where you came from, but it's understanding that you're something bigger than what they tell you you are. We're not individuals. We're people who come from a people, and those understandings, I think, really lend to the African conscience. Having pride in oneself, having pride in not just your skin color, but having pride in what your people were able to build, what your people were able to accomplish, what your community was able to do. I find those things very important. So I would not, even as a socialist, I would not forsake my pride and my African culture for just a human identity. Let's see. Any other questions? Brother Kanada says was never the birth surname of any ancient European. His last name was Scipio. Thank you, Brother Kanada. I did not know that. I actually thought that was his name. Let's see. He says, "Do you think we should practice communalism?" Yes. Anyone who watches this channel should probably know I'm a scientific socialist. Socialism is just I'm trying to word this the way Kwame Ture said it. It's communalism applied to industrialized economy. Meaning, if you take the same principles of communalism, the lands are owned cooperatively. Any private, any personal usage is kind of like a leased or a trusteeship system. You can have this so long as you do not disrupt the land, so as long as you do not do anything we don't agree with on the land, so long as you understand that when we say that this land is no longer needed for your purpose, it goes back to the tribe, to the community. This is African communalism. Similarly, African communalism says that we do not allow for people to be hungry and starving of our community. If one of us has food, we all have food. Taking these same principles and applying it to the 21st century, 2021, about to be 2022. If we apply these things to the same economies, I think you'll end up with a lot of the same policies. So yes, I think that communalism should be practiced, but we should adapt it. And the reason we say scientific socialism, we adapt it based on the conditions that are happening at this time. So at this time, we understand, for example, that things are happening in the tech realm. We understand things are happening in the military defense realm. We understand that the things that would work hundreds of years ago inside of communalist Africa would not be able to protect us and also to sustain us inside of this current world where these Europeans have a lock on the economy, a lock on natural resources, a lock on the military. So that is why we say scientific socialism. Ikemba said no days off. And yes, y'all, we're not coming back tomorrow for the podcast. We're taking one day off, but I will be back next week. Let's see. How can I be effective if other brothers and sisters around me are still under white supremacy? Do we have to separate with like minds or work to change our community mindset? I think it's whatever you feel called to be honest. Some people, I think, have a certain have a way to awaken people. Some people have that certain gift. I think that people like obviously Malcolm X, like they had a gift at being able to awaken people who were very asleep. And if that's your gift and that's what you feel called to, I would say by all means, organize on that. At the same time, some of us I don't think have that gift. I don't know that I have that gift, to be completely honest. When I talk to people who are antagonistic to my views, I've not necessarily been able to get them to walk away from my points or walk away from their beliefs. And so me, I do choose to more so organize among our people. I do feel more like I'm effective there. Even though a lot of people who I work with, people in my organization, we don't agree with each other on everything. We agree with basic tenets that we are Pan-Africanists. We agree that we fight for the liberation of Africa, along with the liberation of the diaspora. We agree that this capitalist enterprise has been to our demise. So we agree on basic tenets. So I think that for me personally, I do feel more effective with people of like mind. But again, there are some people who are very effective, whenever you're with your brothers and sisters. So I think make assessments, about what is it that you feel you operate best with. Because I think that I'll say this, there's a lot of people who will go back and forth with people all day, and they don't necessarily have a gift at awakening the minds of the sleep. I mean, there's some people who will just debate and debate and debate, and you're wasting your time, you know? So if you feel like you are very strong in your convictions, but you're not effective at waking other people up, by all means, get among people who think and act like you. And sometimes people just have to see it to believe it. You know, I always tell people, if you have a problem with ADOS, FBA, don't spend time arguing about Pan-Africanism is this, Pan-Africanism is that, or Pan-Africanism can achieve this or that. Let's just do Pan-Africanism. Let's work. You know, let's show. I mean, I think personally that the idea that America is going to do right by us, do reparations of any substantive means for African descendants, I think that America is showing more and more that they're not willing to, personally. And so you can see for yourself what's working and what's not working. I'm not going to spend my time trying to convince someone that their plan is not working and that they should just get along with my plan. I'm going to try to build with my people, build something for our betterment. That's what I'm going to focus on. And, you know, if you see that, hey, maybe I was wrong, you will think on your own that maybe I should change and, you know, adjust. Hopefully, adjustment's always good. Everyone makes adjustments. Everyone makes changes as far as their ideologies. So I think that that's an important thing to do. Okay, let's see. Oh, this person. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. So someone said, I'm white and African. Can I identify as African? If you're a European of African descent, African's an ethnicity attributed to people of darker pigmentation who come indigenously from the African continent. So I don't believe you would be white and African. You might have be born inside of Africa, but of a European ancestry. Do you identify as African? I've heard white people say that they do. Again, I don't spend time going back and forth with people who on what they identify as politically or whatever. I'll say for me, I don't identify any person of European descent as being of my political identity, because we are just historically have different paths. And I think that if you want to, as a European, identify with Africans, that your first step should be addressing European society for what they're doing wrong to Africans, to what they're doing systemically, and dismantling white supremacy. I think that that would go a long way more than just simply trying to identify with Africans. So there are some people who are Caucasian, who are very much against white supremacy, and not just on paper, who are willing to tear that thing down and willing to be possibly without. Those people who would willingly sacrifice themselves, like Dan Brown, or is it Dan Brown, I believe, who did the slave revolt? No. Oh my gosh. Someone post in the chat, who's the white man that did the slave revolt? I can't think of his name. I said Dan Brown. I'm waiting for y'all. Come help me out. No one knows? Do I have to Google this? Let's see. White man who led slave revolt. I think it was John Brown. Oh. John Brown. Thank you, Chakra. Thank you. Yeah, if you want to be a John Brown and tear the system of white supremacy, that would be a lot more meaningful than simply identifying as African. But yes, I identify Africans as people who are of the continent indigenously. So that's in me. Thanks, y'all. I'm seeing it now. I think there might be a delay on my end. Okay, I think I might have hit all the questions. I don't see anything else. So I'm going to wrap us up. We are at an hour and a half. Thank you all for tuning in. Like I said, I'm going to post my book one more time. Yeah, Dan Brown's the author. Yes. I knew that was someone's name. But yeah, so I'm going to wrap us up. So next week, we're going to be covering a very important chapter, I think, as a follow-up to this chapter. And the title that this is chapter 5, The Decay of Black Communities and Social Unrest. And this is where I think we understand where the agenda for social control comes in, because this African community, these people who brought all these Africans to America, they had a problem on their hands whenever they realized these people could possibly overtake them. So we're going to really talk about how there was a scramble, I would say, to control this this political threat to white supremacy. And this obviously ties right into the child welfare system. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you guys. And I will see you guys next week.